Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to Tech Leaders Hub, episode number 15. The wait is finally over. We're back online and coming to you live. So we hope you'll enjoy the session. And my guest today is Charity Major, CTO at honeycomb.io. Charity, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Nice to see you, Jacob.
Nice to see you too. And I wanted to thank you again, on the record for making it to the, 9
It
a.m.
is
time
early.
slot for you.
It is early in my book for sure. Nice
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
here though.
Yeah, so love to have you here on a very nice session ahead of us, all about writing better software, about observability, all the good stuff. So definitely stay tuned to learn more about that. Some people are still going to be joining in. We do want to give them just a minute or two to launch the stream. Um, and if anybody's already here, the first question is to you, dear watchers and listeners. And by the way, thank you for joining us here. Either if you're watching live, then thank you especially. And even if you're watching the recording, thank you for spending your time with Tech Leaders Hub. If you're watching live, though, let us know if you can see us and if you can hear us and if everything is working right on the technical level. This is getting recorded, and it might get turned into a podcast episode afterwards. So for that purpose, the audio should be great. If there's any issues, let us know. If there's no issues, let us know. Leave a comment, and we'll be monitoring the comments and bringing them up as we go. And as we wait for those to come in, Charity, I wanted to ask you, given the topic that we've selected for the session, given everything that we have to cover, who do you hope is tuning in? Who do you hope to kind of reach with what we've got here? What kind of roles, what kind of situations are they in?
I hope that some of the people who are tuning in are frustrated leaders who are, and it's not just managers, but like tech leaders in general, who are feeling a little bit alone and a little bit maybe at a loss, because I think we're going to talk about some interesting stuff. And, you can never really map directly from one person's situation to another. But I think that when you spend time talking with other smart people and listening to other smart people, it can kind of tug on threads that will kind of get you unstuck from your rut. At least that's how it works for me. So I hope we can do that for some other people today too.
Hey, I love that. Yeah, I seriously love that. So if you're feeling frustrated, you want to get out of your rut, this is the session to get that done for you. And the best way to do that, by the way, as we will be talking, is to just ask the questions that you're curious about. We've got Charity here who's got huge experience, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So just use the fact that this is live and not just pre-recorded.
Live. Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. And we're getting some feedback that at least on YouTube the sound is good. Thank you. And yeah, I'm hoping on LinkedIn we're also got good audio and video. Let us know, dear LinkedIn people. And I suppose that's it for the kind of first word of introduction. Now, the traditional part of Tech Leaders Hub sessions is I try to bring value up front. There's going to be, I'm going to ask you about your background, your situation, story thus far, origin story, all that stuff. But I wanted to first kind of bring value to our watchers and listeners, especially the ones that are kind of tuning in early or, from the very beginning. So the traditional Tech Leaders Hub question that I wanted to ask you about is, what is your number one tip for tech leaders?
Oh gosh, my number one tip? I thought you said I was just supposed to come up with a random tip. I have no idea what a number one tip is. So I'm just going to give you a random tip, which is something that I've been thinking about recently, which is, so we have this channel in Slack that's called this question of the day, right? And one of the recent questions of the day was post a picture of like what's in front of you while you're working. And I started looking around in front of me and going, this is not exactly an energizing or motivating or like clean like vista in front of me. And so I changed it, and now I've got windows in front of me, I've got a clean desk, I feel kind of like I'm king of the mountain and top of the world, and it's really making a difference in like how I feel and the work that I do. I feel like I'm able to concentrate and focus better, and I feel like I'm just a little bit happier for having some motion and some light and some colors in my point of view from where I sit at my desk.
Hey, yeah, that's great. And it is all about the details. And when I look at my current surroundings, it's like it's a white wall, it's a lamp blaring
Right.
at me.
Do you look like you're in prison, or do you look like you're ready to do something creative?
Yeah, I get that. I should take a look at that. I should maybe motivational poster on the wall here would be good.
I don't know. We need to go that far, but like maybe a picture of, rainbows and kittens or something. I don't know, whatever makes you happy. If that's a motivational poster, by all means.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately very susceptible to that kind of stuff. Throw a quote on a face and I'm
Do
there
you
for it.
remember do you remember those demotivational posters that they had back in the
Sure.
90s? Oh my god, I love those. It would be like destiny and the picture of like a cat like falling off of a ledge or something.
Yeah.
They were the best.
It's 10% inspiration, 90%
Yes,
perspiration. Go and do it. Exactly.
right.
So think about your environment. That's number one. That's the tip of the
That's
day,
today's
let's say.
tip. Yeah.
Yeah, that's today's tip. And we're added to the collection of the previous guests on Tech Leaders Hub. Everybody said something different thus far, so I'm super happy about that. All right. Thank you for sharing that. And before we delve into the kind of the topic of the day, what we'll be discussing in terms of observability, everything related to that, and writing better software and DevOps. Although I do have some questions about related to the word DevOps based on our previous conversations. Tease. I wanted to ask you about kind of your background. How do you usually introduce yourself in terms of what you've done, where you've worked, and what is your role currently? How did you kind of end up at this point?
Sure. Well, I still very much think of myself as an operations engineer. I went to college for classical piano performance, dropped out repeatedly, was diagnosed last year with ADHD, which makes a whole lot of things make sense in retrospect. But I just started taking care of computers from one place to the next, and that led me to Silicon Valley. I've run ops for Linden Lab, and then I was infrastructure tech lead at Parse, mobile backend as a service. We got acquired by Facebook. I've written mail software in more than one job. I always seem to end up in charge of the databases somehow. I'm really drawn towards ginormous fires. Like if it's on fire and everything's terrible, that's like a magnet for me. Just ding 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 ding. That's what I do.
Okay, why do you think that is, actually being drawn to these fires?
Well, the medical answer that I'm learning is that when you have ADHD, your brain doesn't produce enough. Like I feed on adrenaline, right? I can't motivate myself unless there's something like some sort of panic button to hit. But like as soon as there's a panic button to hit, if the site's down and nobody knows how to get it up, I get dead calm. Like I am just like I'm high on life. I'm having so much fun and I can focus and it's fantastic. But if it's like, okay, we've got 6 months of work to plan out and here's what I'm going to be doing for the next month and next week and the week after that, I just completely zone out. What I'm doing right now is, kind of based off of the work that we did at Parse and then Facebook, is I'm the CTO and co-founder of Honeycomb.io, which is a 6-year-old startup. Can't believe that. Where we do observability. We were actually kind of the first people to define observability in the context of software engineering and figure out what that meant.
Okay. So I have one question before we delve into Honeycomb, and it's one of those naive, for those who may not be aware type of questions, because very often I'm that person. So you mentioned, I believe you mentioned, you think of yourself as and I'm sorry if I botched the name, operations engineer.
Yeah, it's not what the cool kids call themselves anymore. It was operations engineer or systems engineer. Nowadays, it's all DevOps or SRE or something or platform engineer. So they're all the same thing, though.
Okay, and so if you could, for the people who are not too familiar with it, define what part of the work that person is responsible for. If you could
Sure.
kind of, yeah.
Traditionally, it mostly has to do with infrastructure, right? It's the code that you have to run in order to get to the code that you want to run, right? Whatever that means for you, whether it's like I started out racking servers in the colo and having to like take a cab down at 3 a.m. to like flip the switch and log into the MySQL console. Nowadays, most of our operations people actually work for Amazon, which is fantastic. So the role of operations is segued into a lot more of almost an internal consultant, like helping software engineers figure out how to run and support their own services in production, or just like being a repository of best practices and doing a lot of incident management and like post hoc reviews. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about ops in the future and the past history of operations forever, but Hopefully that's enough to give users a bit of a
Yeah.
perspective.
I love how you said that it's the code that you have to run to get you to the code that you want to run. Yeah, that's super
That's why
quotable.
it's seen as a cost center in most places, right? Which is
Uh,
why I think it's, if you love infrastructure, you should kind of think of there being like a fork in the road right now. If you love infrastructure, you should probably start thinking about how to work for companies that do infrastructure, like that do infrastructure as their business, right? They're solving a category problem for the world, whether that's like, PagerDuty or Honeycomb, or right? Because anywhere else, it's going to be important, but it's always going to be how little can we get away with doing, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
there's interesting. It's not like ops people are ever going to go away. My God, it's only getting harder and harder to run systems.
Yeah.
But increasingly it's going to be like you're in the role of trying to figure out how to do less and less infrastructure for your company, right? So just a
Yeah.
personal.
And I suppose I wonder if you would say if that's accurate, if that shift is already happening in the sense of, you used to have to think about your own physical servers, and now that has
Yep.
moved more to the cloud. So that's kind of
Oh yeah, it's been going
yeah.
on
So
for
that should
decades and it will keep
yeah,
going on, right? Now we've got serverless and everything.
yeah,
Yeah, we're just moving higher and higher up the stack, and a lot of people get a little antsy about this, and they're like, well, you're just trying to make software engineers do all the jobs, like we can't do everything at once. And it's like, no, that's fair. Like you don't have to do all the jobs, um, but you don't have to know how to run your own code in production. Like I think of that as
yeah.
being like there was a period of time there where we thought that wasn't the case, where where software engineers could write and ship code and then walk out the door and let someone else deal with it. Like I think we've all universally concluded that was a bad idea, and it didn't work, and we're going to be picking up the pieces from that experiment for years to come.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, I get that. So now shifting kind of gears back to Honeycomb, and you mentioned, within that realm of operations that, you're a company that really focuses on that and wants to solve this, specific problems within that realm. So tell me about that. What kind of problems and why actually? What's the incentive behind? Well, not the incentive, but kind of the motivation behind actually starting a company focused just on that.
Pain, really, lots and lots and lots of pain.
I love that answer. Okay.
um, when I was at Parse is a mobile backend of the service. So if you're a developer, you just had SDKs and APIs. You could build a mobile app just using Parse, right? We do everything for you on the back end.
Uh-huh.
And Parse is doing a lot of things kind of before its time. Like we were doing microservices before there were microservices. Like we helped MongoDB grow up. Like we had to implement our own sharding. We had to do a lot of stuff that, 5 years later, the rest of the world was kind of coming around and starting to do. And there was no tooling for it. There was very little language for it. And Parse was down all the time. Like it was professionally humiliating to me just how often we were going down, right? Because
Okay.
we were running like a pool of Ruby web servers with no multi-threading, and so whenever any of the systems behind it, any database, any storage system, any other third-party system, whenever anything got slow or went down, it would get slow or go down for everyone immediately, right? Before you could react, and I got woken up by this, night after. My team and I, we were working like it was grueling. It's the worst on-call experience I've ever had. And
Huh, yeah.
when we got acquired by Facebook, we started using some of their tools. We hooked up this one tool called Scuba, and all of a sudden, the amount of time it took us to identify these novel problems that were happening dropped like a rock, like from hours, days, like you really didn't know how long it was going to take for you to figure this out, down to like seconds, like not even minutes. Like it wasn't even an engineering problem anymore. It was like a
Oh,
support problem.
okay.
And the problem here is that the system wasn't failing in systematic ways. Like traditionally, you get to know a system, and it's like how it's going to fail, right? You can predict most of the ways, you can guess the rest, and
Mhm.
then something breaks. You're like you pattern match. Oh, it's this again. Oh, it's that again. Oh, it's this again.
Yeah, yeah.
But with Parse, it was like a different app would be hitting the iTunes top 10 like every week, and you couldn't predict where it was going to come from. You couldn't predict. It wasn't always the app with the most traffic or the most write load. Like it was something different every time, and so we started using Scuba. We started to get a handle on our systems, and I walked away from that realizing that, the tools that we had built for, the last generation of architecture and infrastructure, they were built for this predictable world where you mostly had known unknowns. And very rarely you had a real unknown unknown. And then it was like, all hands on deck, everybody trying to figure out. But that's not the world we live in now. The world we live in now has, it's ephemeral, it's dynamic, it's transient. We don't spin up banks of servers and then like curate them for months. Like we might be deploying entire new fleets like every day, right? You can't predict what's going to break. You don't know what's going on. You have to be able to explore. You have to have a system that deals with high cardinality, high dimensionality, and it has to be open-ended, because it really is all about solving those unknown unknowns, because every single day with distributed systems, there's a new unknown unknown that you have to be able to solve. And so that was the origin story of observability, is realizing that, the previous generation of tools all built around the metric, right? All built around monitoring. It's a very post hoc, it's a very reactive sort of way of dealing with your systems, versus observability, which is, if there's 3 pillars of observability, they're high cardinality, high dimensionality, and explorability. Because, the old way of debugging, basically you'd have all these dashboards. Every dashboard is like some relic of some past outage. And when something breaks, you just start flipping through them. You're just like, your eyeballs are just scanning, looking for correlations. That's not fucking science. That's not actually debugging. That's just like pattern matching. And yet that's been like state of the art for trying to understand our systems for the past 2 decades.
All right, yeah. So I get that this is kind of the old way, and without observability, you're stuck with that kind of way of working. So tell me more about observability then. And okay, first of all, I'm curious about one particular thing, and I'm sorry if that's obvious, and I'm making a fool of myself here. But is this a term that you kind of coined here, or is this something that you kind of, because right now the reason I'm asking is I don't know if you know, but when I type in your name on Google, it auto completes to Charity Major's observability. So obviously,
I had no idea. That's really funny. Thank you.
Did you know you have a Wikipedia page?
No shit. Do I?
You do.
I'm gonna have to look for that.
And it is all about that, and your kind of your
How
connection
funny.
and kind of deep expertise in that. So I wanted to ask.
No, I didn't.
Is that something
I
you
did not.
coined, or-
I did not come up with the word. It stems from the 60s actually, and from control theory, and
Oh.
it it's a mechanical engineering term for like control systems, and what observability is there is the mathematical dual of controllability. So basically, it's saying, how well can you understand your systems by looking at it from the outside, and to the extent that you can understand them, you can control them. Now, the term wasn't really in use when we started Honeycomb, but the first year or so of Honeycomb was such a struggle just trying to figure out how to talk about what we were doing. Like every term in data is so overloaded, right? And everybody's using the same words to talk about the same thing. But I knew from the beginning, we knew that we weren't a monitoring tool, right? And I think it was like July of that first year, like halfway through the year, when I Googled the term observability and I read the mechanical engineering definition. And I just had like light bulbs going off in my head. I was like, oh my God, this is what we're trying to do, but with software. We're trying to make it so that you can understand any inner system state just by asking questions from the outside, right? No matter how novel the state is, no matter whether it's ever happened before or it will ever happen again, no matter if anyone's ever seen it before, you have to be able to, just by asking questions and iterating from the outside without any prior knowledge and without shipping any custom code, because shipping custom code to handle the situation implies that you understood it in advance in order to understand the situation, right?
Yeah.
So we started talking about it, and it just started fleshing out what that means. Like if we say that observability means the ability to understand any internal system state, what does that mean? Like what are the requirements? Because one requirement is you have to be able to ask pretty much any question, which means that you have to be able to support high cardinality and high dimensionality, right? And when I say high cardinality, I mean, imagine you have like a collection of 100 million users. The highest possible cardinality would be any dimension would be anything that's a unique ID, like a social security number in the US, or a UUID, right? First name and last name are less high cardinality, but still very high cardinality. But there's duplicates, right? So they're not as high cardinality as a unique ID.
Yeah.
The lowest possible cardinality, a single value, like so species equals human. All of the people in the set are humans, right? And then somewhat lower cardinality things like hair color, whatever. So it turns out that all of the tools that have been built up until then for dealing with understanding your systems were based on metrics which only handle really low cardinality dimensions. But the most valuable information when you're debugging is almost always going to be the high cardinality stuff, because that's what's the most identifying, right? Shopping cart ID, or or fan ID, or any of these things. And the tooling up till then just didn't support it. The other thing that's super is high dimensionality, which means so like if you think of those key values, right? The cardinality refers to the value, like how many unique values are in a set, and dimensions refers to like the key, like how many dimensions are in an event. Because with metrics, again, you only have like a couple of dimensions tops, but with observability, you have when you instrument your code, you can have up to hundreds, right? So you can just string them together like one after the other, and you can see how this becomes really valuable when you're thinking about trying to find outliers, right? Say you look at your dashboard and you see a big spike of errors, right? There's a big blotch of red. Well, typically in the past you'd have your dashboards and you just like start going, well, is it a shard? No. Well, is it a memcache? Whatever. But in fact, often it's none of those things, because it's none of the components. But what's wrong is they're erroring for everyone who's running this version of Android, who's running this particular version of the build, who's running, maybe this language pack, who's running, you get the picture. It's like all these different things that have to be chained together in order for you to figure out who is it actually failing for.
Okay. Wow. So it's possible to identify that, for example, this outage is happening for people on Android in Spain, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we did this, around year 3 or year 4, we built this really cool thing called Bubble Up, which, so you make a heat map of the thing that you're looking at, and anything you want to explain, whether it's a spike or a cluster or whatever, you just draw a little bubble around it. And then we pre-compute for all the dimensions inside the bubble and outside the bubble. And then we sort them and diff them, so you can see exactly what's different about the area that you've circled on the heat map, whether it's one thing or 20.
Okay. All right. So
it's so cool.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And, the kind of thought that immediately pops in my mind is, how do you actually make that possible? And before we delve into that, though, it's like I have like an incomplete loop in my mind now, because you mentioned 2 pillars, and what was the third one? And can you tell me about that?
Explorability, just it being very open-ended. The other problem with dashboards is that they tend to be very static. You can flip through them, but you can't just dig down into them, right? You can't just click and go, show me more about that, or go deeper there, or add this, right? That explorable sort of like, which is the way you debug, right? You go down a path and you're exploring, and then lost the trail, you need to back up a couple steps, and then you go back to where you found it, and then you start debugging again, right? Like dashboards like don't let you do that, and so like it's super key that observability lets you have a very explorable, open-ended way of dealing with your system data.
Okay, so, and then back to the question I was just about to ask, because now I got the 3 pillars. Thank you. Kind of that's how my brain works. So how is that all possible? Because you have to kind of somehow get that information and make it possible to browse and explore. So how do you? I assume this is something that kind of Honeycomb brings to the table as a product, right?
Yeah, totally. No, to start with, something that anybody can do and everyone should do is like, instead of using metrics or like unstructured logs, which just junky strings, you should instrument your code so that you're aggregating data only around the event, and so that you're producing these arbitrarily wide structured data blobs, like one per request per service, that has the full context, right? So for example, a request enters the service, and you initialize, we initialize an empty Honeycomb event, and then we pre-populate it with anything we know about, whether it's, parameters that are being passed in, the environment, language internals, whatever. And then while the code is executing in that service, you as a developer might go, oh, I want to plop the shopping cart ID on there. That might be useful someday. Or, oh, this variable might be useful someday. And you just stuff it all there in the blob. And then when the request is ready to exit or error, it gets shipped off to Honeycomb, or just printed out to a log or Elastic or whatever as this arbitrarily wide structured data blob. And then, if you have multiple services, you might do that, for each service or whatever. But this allows you to go back and reconstruct and correlate all these outliers because you've got all that information bundled up around, and it's from the perspective of your user, right? So, previously in the past, it was basically impossible. If a user started complaining about what was going, about their experience, you could go and you'd look at dashboard, you see like spikes, but you couldn't actually say if those spikes of errors were things that user was experiencing, because you couldn't, like you had discarded all that connective tissue at the time that you wrote out the metric. Now, if you've collected the data this way, and if you stored them in these wide structured logs, you can go back and reconstruct and go, oh yeah, this user, I see where they, here's the trace, right? Here's where you can see that we were doing like 15 different calls to MySQL in a row, and it was timing out. The other beautiful thing about observability, as you can see, is that it links engineers so much more tightly with their users' experience than they have ever been before, right? Like using monitoring tools, you were always like, you kind of had to go to an ops person to get translated. Like, you ship some code and you start seeing like CPU load average rising or like memory, spiking. It's like, okay, what's happening? How does this relate to the code that I just wrote and shipped, right? Because because it doesn't. And so it's important that observability speak to the engineer in the language of endpoints and variable names, not like, here's the 4 different kinds of resident memory, and here's everything under /proc.
Okay, so it's more about what's happening. I'm going to probably either oversimplify or totally misrepresent. Bear with me. But so it's not about what's happening with the servers and the infrastructure. It's more what's happening kind of within the code,
with your code
itself.
Yeah, very much.
I got it. Okay.
You did. You totally did. Yeah, okay. That's exactly it. And like our thesis is that as time moves on and as we're all moving farther and farther up the stack, right? Software engineers, and even operations engineers like me, like we really should have to care about the infrastructure itself less and less, right? Because we've built these infrastructures that are much more resilient, much more reliable. We've outsourced large parts of it to, Amazon's running RDS for me, et cetera. But what you have to care about is, how does your code work? How are your users experiencing it? And you need to be able to understand it in a rich, intimate level very quickly, very, swiftly. You need to be able to turn around bug fixes. You need to, move at a much more rapid speed and with much more intimacy than with your infrastructure. Monitoring is the right tool for infrastructure, always will be. And you care about, is your system up? The extent that you have control over that. Sometimes you don't even have control over it, right? But what you can control is, how is my code performing in this environment for these users right now?
Okay. So if I'm getting this right, it's also about, because when I'm trying to kind of adopt the observability mindset here, and it's all about, appending more information to what actually gets logged. So it's not so vague, right? So you're
richer
kind
context.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of, it's like, I don't know if this piece of information is going to be useful. At some point it might be. So let's add the shopping cart ID, etc. in there. Exactly.
And a pathology of metrics was always that, you could add more metrics, but the cost went up linearly with every single one that you added. And versus with observability, it is effectively free. It's basically free because you've already got the event and you're just tossing on a couple more bits onto the end, right?
All right. Okay, so I'm thinking, to put this into more practical terms, because I think I understand the concept, but somebody who might be hearing about this concept for the first time, wanting to implement that, is there a good particular, and I don't pretend to have the kind of actual tech knowledge to suggest something, but is there a good starting point, a particular point in the application where it's good to start thinking about observability? Is it kind of early in the process, later in the process? What would be the advice here?
Yeah, I mean, it's always better to do it earlier because it's kind of like, once you get used to having observability, it's like having glasses when you drive down the road, especially if you're blind like me, right? Like the idea of going without them is just like, why would I do that? It would be so slow and treacherous and dangerous, Like people are writing code out there with very little signal about what actually happens once they've shipped it, right? And
Mhm.
once you get in the rhythm of just like instrumenting it, and then shipping it, and then going and looking at your instrumentation, and saying, is it doing what I expected it to do? And does anything else look weird? Right? When you just get in the rhythm of doing that, you make so many fewer errors. You find them so much more quickly. You have so much cleaner code, so much more understandable systems. It's just, you know, we we struggle to get people to try us, but then once they've tried it, you can't pry it out of their cold dead hands, because you get used to that security, right? And you get used to that dopamine hit of just like finding things and understanding them, and like, it's just really, really hard to go back to not to like driving blind again after that.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And it's like, I'm not sure if this totally relates one to one, but it's like when I'm looking at the users on our website as well, just from the marketer kind of perspective, it's like I would like to know more about what's happening there. I would like to know more
Yeah.
about the context of, they wanted to, I don't know, they started filling out a form but didn't finish. More context around that would be great. So
Yeah.
maybe there's a tool for that too. Probably there is somewhere out there. And anyway,
Totally.
so I wanted to kind of, because thank you. Initially coming into this, I was really kind of keen to find out about the observability, the mechanics around that, and I'm glad to say that now I can wrap my head around that, and that's all
Awesome.
thanks to you and your explanation. And now, with the topics of the kind of the broader topic of the session at hand, we did promise writing better software, not just with observability, but also through some other practices. And one practice that I'm particularly curious about, we discussed this during our prep call, and I really wanted to bring it to the live session because it's like, I have so many questions about specifically on-call developers. So, you mentioned, and I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting here, but it's like, it's a way to write better software, to address issues faster. I have a question from a bit of a different standpoint. I'm thinking, in terms of being on call, is that usually a difficult conversation with developers to have them to be on call? Because I'm imagining my life being on call. It's like you have to constantly be alert, constantly be on the lookout for issues to happen. So is it usually a difficult conversation, or is the thinking behind it just different?
It used to be a harder conversation.
Oh, I
5,
see.
6 years ago, when we started talking about this sort of thing, there was a lot of pushback from engineers who were just like, that's not my job. I'm scared. I have a life, I have a family, and all this stuff. I think that the world's moved and changed a lot in the direction of, it's just our systems have gotten so hard and so complex that, everybody's kind of just acknowledged that there really isn't a good way to understand and build these systems without engineers being on call for their own code, right? For better or for worse.
I see.
But also at the same time, I feel like it's really important to push back against the idea that we're trying to make developers as miserable as ops people have historically been, because the whole point of this is that this is how we should make systems better. Like, nobody should have to be a masochist. Nobody should have to be suffering like this, right? Like, I think that anyone who builds a 24/7 highly available service should be willing to be woken up a couple times a year. And I also think that nobody who runs a highly available service should be woken up more than a few times a year. Like, it shouldn't be severely life impacting. It shouldn't be something that you dread. Like, it should be something that you kind of look forward to. Like, I think that I've seen a lot of places have a lot of success with making being on call something that is a sign of respect, that senior engineers are, you are qualified to do this. It's something that people take seriously. It legitimately is something that puts you, that can I like to, like, Liz and I have talked about this. It's like salt in the soup, right? You don't want a lot of it, but a little of it like makes it more intense, makes it more real, makes you more in tune with your users, makes you write better code, makes you more aware of how the system is performing, makes you a better engineer, like, full stop, makes you so much better of an engineer. And like, there are ways to do it. So, like, the key here, of course, is number one, you have to make sure that there's actually enough time given to the teams to fix the stuff that's wrong. You can't just keep, kicking the can down the curb and like making people suffer to hold the shit up, right? That's not actually okay. And number two, like, people who are on call shouldn't also be expected to be like shipping features or writing code. Like, I feel super strongly that It should be a week where you pay attention to the system. You do some tidying up, you fix some things that have always kind of bothered you, some things you've always kind of wanted to do or that you've never been able to finish. It's a time where you get to use your agency, where you get to use your judgment as a software engineer. It's a time where you get to switch gears a bit and do something different and do some really meaningful work that is kind of in a different lane than you're usually in. And I think that if you do these things, I think that it shouldn't be, a thing that people dread.
I see. So could you make this more concrete for me in terms of, how do you frame this? You're speaking to a developer, you're saying, okay, you're on call. First of all, and again, I'm sorry, pardon my ignorance, and I hope some of the watchers and listeners are curious too. What is the usual time frame for being on call, and what does that entail, exactly? You're on call, which means, from what I understand, if issues pop up that can be fixed, through your coding, go and do it. And other than that, how does it actually work in practice?
Oh, it's really hard to generalize because there are as many different on-call rotations as there are teams. The kind of traditional one, like at Honeycomb, the way it looks is, you're on call for a week. You have a rotation, 5 to 7 people per rotation typically. We do handoffs on Tuesdays because, a lot of times there's 3-day weekends on Mondays, and, we just figured Tuesday's a better day. And there are like 4 or 5 on-call, 3 or 4 on-call rotations, one for platform, one for product, one for the telemetry team. I think there might be a 4th one too. And the platform team is as you'd expect much more focused on reliability and stuff, and the product one is much more focused on bug bounties and feature fixes, interaction bug fixes, that sort of thing, or supporting customers directly. Right, there are on-call rotations that don't even involve carrying a pager, but they do involve being on call for, say, customer success or other teams internally that interface with customers. We also have Liz Fong Jones, who now works in Australia. So a lot of times we have sort of an informal follow the sun pager rotation where if it happens during the night, Liz picks it up, which is really sweet, right? Yeah. A lot of places will formalize a sort of 12 hours on, 12 hours off when they have people around the world. There are other places that, do rotations like half a week, 3 days counting the weekend, or 4 days not counting the weekend. So you buddy, and the choices here, the choices you need to make here are all, they're very personal, right? How heavy is your load? Are you doing in a transitional phase? Are you in a stage where, you're digging out from under some tech debt? And, there are all kinds of different configurations that you can muster.
Okay. All right, very interesting. And what advice would you have to somebody who is, again, I'm thinking of people who heard about this concept, on-call developers. I should try that. How do you start then? How do you, again, run the additional conversations?
Shadow someone.
Sorry?
Shadow someone. Pair up with somebody who's used to being on call, and first you shadow them and you're their secondary while they are the primary, right? And then you can be primary and they'll be secondary, so you always have someone to escalate to. But just there's no way through the jungle but through the jungle. You just got to kind of jump in at some point.
Okay, so but you're saying this is getting started from the perspective of being a developer on call. I'm thinking, would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I thought that was a question.
Yeah, so the question would be, from the perspective of somebody who is managing that team. I was thinking, implementing that, practice in the first place. How do you get started with that?
Yeah. Well, you'd want to talk to the people who are currently on call, right? And just typically those people are ecstatic to have software engineers want to jump in and help with this sort of thing. Yeah. So, you just want to ask how you can help and go from there, I guess.
Ask how we can help. Okay. All right, I get that. All right, and that's kind of the second ingredient that we had for writing better software. That we promised within the topic. And by the way, watchers and listeners, if you have questions, definitely contribute them. I am,
nobody's asked any questions yet.
Not thus far, but I am assuming they're as riveted, listening.
Is there anybody listening to us?
Yes, there are. Okay. I can see the stats in front of me.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah. Any questions related to this? Let us know. Questions. Okay, I'm going to kind of give it to you straight here. We did promise quite a few topics to cover in the kind of live stream description.
I've been talking a lot, haven't I?
So it's like we're probably not going to cover all of the bullet points in there. If there's anyone particular that you care about, then now would be a good time to bring it up, because then
And we'll talk about it.
yeah, then we'll talk about it. And if not, then we might run out of time for this particular session. And speaking of comments, we do have one coming up. I'm going to bring it up then. And before I go into my own questions further, how does and let me just read it because again, podcast later. Thank you. How does Honeycomb Luke has this question? How does Honeycomb observe their own systems? Is there a second Honeycomb instance?
I love this question. Honeycomb has a real dog history. Like we've always had office dogs, and all of our services are named after dogs, like Retriever and Shepherd and Poodle and stuff. So we have you can see where I'm going with this. We have the Honeycomb production cluster, and then we have the dog food cluster.
Okay.
And
yeah.
dog food watches production, and then we have a third one that's called Kibble, and Kibble watches dog food.
Okay. So that's the instruction.
When we're deploying, we automatically deploy. Like if somebody merges or changes the main, it'll get automatically deployed within the next hour, and it gets first auto deployed to Kibble, and then it bakes for like an hour, and then it automatically gets promoted to dog food, and then it automatically gets promoted to production.
Sorry, what do you mean by it bakes for an hour? I'm very curious about that.
It runs, and we have a fair number of like monitoring checks and end-to-end checks, and if none of them go wrong, or if nobody reports any problems, then we automatically promote it.
Oh, okay. So it's a test. If nothing goes wrong with this for an hour, then it's ready to kind of go to the next stage, so to speak. Okay, Luke, I hope that answers the question. If you've got any more, definitely send them our way. And now what it was building up to was, this third element of writing better software, and that was shorter delivery times. So I think everybody cares about that, but how do you actually achieve that? What's the key here?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Just to digress a little bit, it's really hard to try, as an engineering leader, not just managers, but like as any senior engineering person, like we're all under a lot of stress and pressure to like ship faster and, do better and everything. And, there's always so many things that are broken, so many things that need to be fixed, whatever. And anytime that I'm talking to somebody who just seems, the first thing that I always ask them is like, how long does it, if you wanted to ship a single line of code to production, like how long would it take you using the normal CI/CD process? Because I very strongly feel that like 15 minutes or bust, man. Like if you can get your CI/CD pipeline to automatically deploy in less than 15 minutes, you are going to free up so much time and energy, and you are going to have so much more functional of a team, so much more functional of working environment. The thing is that when that interval starts to blossom, when it starts to get up to like 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour or whatever, you start to spend so much time waiting on each other. You get into like what I think of as like the software development sort of death spiral, where your diffs get larger and it takes longer to code review them, and it takes longer to deploy them. Now all of a sudden you're batching up a bunch of people's changes and deploying all of them at once, which means that when something breaks, you don't know whose it was, and you have to roll that back from all, and you have to like track down a bunch of people and try. Now you've ruined like everyone's afternoon, right? Like, and pretty soon you're going to need like a a special release manager or release engineers, or you're going to need SREs, because it's non-trivial to debug what's going wrong when you just deployed 20 people's changes, right? Like, and it just I have a rule of thumb that I can't prove, but I believe is true, which is that if it takes X number of engineers to build, run, maintain a system with 15 minutes or less, if you have an hour-long interval instead, it takes twice as many people. And if you have a day-long interval, it takes twice as many again. And if you have a week-long interval, it takes twice as many again. It takes so many more people hours the longer and longer that interval get. And there are all these pathologies that you're going to run around just trying to bat down, because it's these diffs are too large. Oh, code review takes so long. Oh, our deploy system is broken. Oh, all this stuff. And really, you just need to bring it back to the source. Like 15 minutes or less, like your life is not going to be a good one until you can get that that interval down to something very short and manageable.
I love that. That's such a clear goal to work towards, and I think you made a very strong case for how it all goes wrong when that interval gets shorter. So I can definitely see the why and why it's important, and why tech leaders should focus on that. And now, as for the how, how do you actually address that and start getting there?
Totally. So something you can do with Honeycomb, with our free tier, you don't have to spend any money at all. You can instrument your build pipeline, right? The entire CI/CD process, you can instrument it as a trace. So you can visualize it and see where all that time is going. And from that point, it's just engineering, right? You just start, okay, where are tests taking too long? What are the flaky ones? Where do we need to parallelize? Which ones are old? Which ones should we take out, right? And just like, it's not glamorous work, but it's not technically challenging. It just needs to be done. You just need to set an internal SLO for yourselves. We're not going to let it be above this number of minutes, right? And whenever it gets above that number of minutes, whoever's on call goes and like does the work to get it back down under spec, right? Like it can absolutely be done, and it just takes some discipline.
All right. Yeah. So very often that's. I feel like this is the type of work that very often makes all of the difference. The type that is not glamorous, the type that takes discipline, and it's not just in engineering. Let me tell you. Now, thinking about our workload, sometimes in marketing, it goes back to that. It does really. All right, we've got a question coming in. It's a bit of a long one, so give me a sec to read it. Pulling it up, it's disappeared. Okay, there it is. So, I suppose I would pronounce that name. Innocenti is asking, and sorry if I mispronounce. Any advice on reorienting an engineering org towards engineering for resilience? How to surface the importance of treating the system as a socio-technical system versus just a code in production? So I love this question because it touches upon the socio-technical system that I was also going to ask about. So let's dive right in. Maybe let's expand on that term first, and then let's try to answer the question if we could.
Socio-technical, the term, is that what you mean?
Yes. I thought maybe we'll start there.
Sure. Socio-technical is just exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that we show up to work every day on systems that are not just technology and they're not just people, but they are the complex interactions and like interweavings of humans and the software that we build and the impact that software has upon us, which is I think a much better way of thinking about these problems, because anytime that you try to solve a team's problem just by throwing code at it, it's probably not going to work, because there are habits involved, there are egos involved, there's history involved. But also when you try and solve these problems by just doing people stuff, this is why we can't just go and hire good people managers who have zero technical skills and expect them to be effective as an engineering manager. Like there are great people managers at Starbucks, but you can't take them and make them effective with the software engineering team, because you need to have that overlapping skill set. How to surface the importance of treating the system like a socio-technical system versus code in production? Oh my goodness, this is a question that just opens up so many questions. I would start by asking, I would start by asking, like, what's your level and your role? Like, are you a manager? Are you an IC? Why do you think that your team, who doesn't treat it like a socio-technical system? Like, is it your managers, your directors, your entire organization? It's so hard to know where to start with these things, but I guess I would start by saying, if you're an IC and you look around and you have no allies whatsoever, if there's nobody else in the company who feels the way that you feel, you should just leave. If you can't find allies, you should start talking to them, right? Maybe there are other managers, maybe there are other ICs. And if you don't know if you have allies or not, then be curious. Be curious. There are probably other people out there who think and feel the same way that you do, But take them out for drinks, or like have a Slack coffee session or whatever, and just like talk about these things. There is so much scope for engineers to be leaders in these ways without having to be tapped by anyone, without having to be asked
Yeah.
by anyone, without having to be given a promotion or a title. In fact, this is kind of the best way to get a promotion and a title in a lot of ways, is to take a team, if nobody's really, exercising their agency, or making any changes, there's nothing stopping you from going and instrumenting that build pipeline to see where the time is going, and like making incremental changes there, right? That's, like we just said, it's unglamorous work, but it's work that everyone will notice. It will impact everyone's lives for the better, and you'll get a
Yes.
lot of street cred. And when you start making things better, people will start coming to you and asking for your opinion, right? And they'll start including you in decisions being made. We have so much power as engineers. Like, it just don't wait to be asked is my advice, I guess. But if your efforts are not being rewarded, if nobody's listening to you, go find another fucking job, because there are lots of people out there who will pay you a lot of money to do this thing that you're currently being frustrated trying to do.
Okay. Well, I really like that advice. And I did have one follow-up still revolving around this question. First of all, I wanted to say I love the concept of what you're mentioning here. I heard it called informal leadership. You don't have to have a leadership title to actually go out there and, lead a
Yeah.
change. And like you
Yep.
said, it's a very good signal towards actually getting a more leadership position. And now, sticking to this topic for a second, we talked about this from the perspective of an IC. This being Tech Leaders Hub, I'd be remiss not to ask from the other perspective. If you actually do have a manager position, then how do you? Again, the question is about reorienting towards resilience, towards seeing it as a socio-technical system. So could you also give that part of the story?
Yeah, sure. In some ways, it's harder to make these changes as as a manager, I think,
Is it?
because, well, it's not your job to do the things, it's your job to inspire and motivate other people to do the things, right?
Yeah.
As an engineer, you can just go get out your hammer and start, banging down those tests. As a manager, you might be able to do that too, but ultimately your success is going to bridge on, whether or not you can get other people to believe in your vision of the future, and follow you in the direction you want to go.
Yeah.
So, like, the part about engineering for resilience, I mean, the place I would start there is with, having retros, making sure that the dots are getting, crossed, making sure that when you have outages, you're making sure that you allocate enough time to figure out what happened and actually fix those things. When it comes to, the socio-technical system, I mean, that's your bread and butter. That's what you do every day. Like, it's a little puzzling to me to.
Yeah, I get that. I would say, I would suppose, and not to speak from experience here, but just using that term, it unlocked something in my brain. Just having that concept in my mind already, it shows that you can look at both together, the people and the tech and the feedback loops between them. So already having that in my mind, I think is already a step forward.
Consider like doing a brown bag, everybody sit in the room and have lunch and watch an interesting talk together that talks about some of the stuff, and then discuss afterwards.
Yeah, they could rewatch our talk, for example.
Yeah, there you go. Bring your team.
Okay, awesome. And I do have more questions, but we do also have a comment coming in. It is huge though, so let me read it and then let's see if and how we can address this, okay? So Luke is back with another question. Thanks, Luke. He's asking, for an ISV engineering team where you have a traditional deployment model and you're not a hosted or cloud provider, so packages given to customers who deploy their own servers, have their own ops teams, etc., what would you suggest for integrating observability to make the lives of the customer easier? And I'm hoping you can also kind of explain the question here.
Do you know
and
what
also answer.
ISV means?
It would be good for you to define it for people who might not know it, who might be me also.
I don't know what it means,
I see.
ISV.
Okay. Yeah. So I suppose that would be important for Luke to also answer for us, but there is a bit of a delay, which I'm trying to fill now. So if you could kind of give us more
totally. You're not a hosted cloud provider. Which is for integrating observability to make the lives of the customer easier. Well, so so I'm assuming you're giving the customer, you're giving them some code, it's packaged, and it must be code that you own. So hopefully you've instrumented it. So you can instrument it with high arbitrarily wide structured data blobs, the rich, structured logs, that they can then, tail out into Honeycomb or, some tool that will let them do observability. That would be my recommendation.
Okay, so Luke is saying ISV stands for independent software vendor. So does that kind of fit the answer?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. All right, so that's the answer to that question, Luke, and thank you for being a very active part of our conversation. Always love to see that, and I can hardly believe it, but it's like we're 55 minutes into the conversation
Holy crap.
already. So I know, holy crap, indeed. So I was thinking if we could have one more question from the audience would be great, but I'm not seeing one, so I'm going to ask my own question. I'm actually glad to ask that because this is also something that this session initially was supposed to be called something like Better DevOps through, on-call devs,
right.
shorter software delivery, and observability. So now, and then you left a comment in our doc, which I was very curious about. I think it said something about DevOps being kind of outdated, or speaking of the challenges, of the past decade, is I think what you said. Could you expand on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel a little wobbly about the term DevOps, and it's not that there's anything wrong with DevOps. Some of my best friends are DevOps. It's just I'm starting to really start associating the term DevOps with like the last decade's problems, and much less so with modern software systems. I mean, because DevOps is all about this idea that there's this great divide between dev teams and ops teams, and the wall that must be unsiloed and torn down and everything. And like, what if you don't have that fucking wall? We don't have a wall, so there's nothing to like rail against or tear down or anything. Like my ops teams basically work for Amazon, and my software engineers own their own code in production, and like DevOps is kind of like less relevant.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that instead of DevOps, you would be just using ops or dev and ops, or what would be the alternative?
In what context?
Yeah, because I'm thinking, in the context that people are using DevOps right now, like DevOps engineer, what would be the substitute?
I mean, SRE is one substitute, although I've never liked the term SRE because I feel like it reduces everything that I do to like reliability, which like reliability is part of it, but it's not like the world. I like systems engineer, platform engineer is fine. I will never not love the term operations engineer because I feel like there's a certain amount of reclamation that needs to happen there. Like I'm not ashamed of being ops. Ops is a valiant, form of engineering. It's never going away. And I will forever hate the people who are all no ops and like, less ops the better. It's just not true. Like, if development is like, sorry, I'll stop ranting.
All right. Yeah, no, I did love listening to that. And okay, so do we have time for one more question, do you think? Because I am curious about one thing that you just said.
I'm fine.
Okay, awesome. Because you just said, and this is like a classic question that I wanted to ask you, that the job of an operations engineer, through the lens of SRE, it's it's mostly about reliability. You're saying it's not just about reliability.
No, God no.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole, slew of things within that slew of things, that those areas of responsibility, of interest. What is the one thing, we're putting out a message to the world that you would like people to know that this also falls under what an operations engineer is interested in?
Sorry, repeat.
So, I'm thinking if it's not just reliability, what else
is it?
Is there? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's architecture, there's building things, there's CI/CD delivery times, there's there's resiliency, there's training people internally, there's mentorship, there's it's as much, it makes it sound like we run things that other people build, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not true. We build shit all day long and run it, right? And that's the future of engineering. We're all building things and owning what we build, whether it's infrastructure or software.
Okay. Oh, I love that as a final thought here, as we are kind of nearing the end of the session. Luke is saying, I cannot not highlight this. Thank you for the insights today and for answering
Thanks,
the
Luke.
questions. I assume it says charity majors at the end there because he tagged you on LinkedIn.
I
We're
see
going to
it.
have to, yeah, we're going to
It's
have to
good.
assume that. And yeah, I mean, the session flew by. Thank you so much for sharing what you
My
know.
pleasure.
And I wanted to ask you, is there anything you want to kind of announce? Anywhere, people can follow you, follow Honeycomb? Are you hiring? Anything else that, you'd like to put out
Sure.
there?
Yeah, you can follow me at twitter.com/mipsytipsy. You can follow Honeycomb at /honeycombio. We are hiring. I will tweet out the jobs link again. And it's a really great place to work. If you want to work at a place that is, I feel like we're working in the future in a lot of ways. And if you're curious
Awesome.
about what that looks like, you should consider joining us.
All right. Yeah, I love that. And in terms of SDX Next, if anybody's meeting us for the first time watching this, first of all, hi, very glad to have you here and to meet us through such a lovely session. If you're curious about what we do, we are Europe's largest software development company that specializes in Python. So if you have this type of need, a project that requires development, design, we do call it DevOps still, I'm sorry to say.
That's okay.
And we do.
You do you.
And we do offer it. So if your stack is Python, JavaScript based, Node.js, React Native, we can help with that. We've got people who can help with that. Reach out to us, sdxnext.com. I think that's the shortest I've done this kind of
Well
blurb.
done.
Yeah, and also in terms of Tech Leaders Hub, techleadershub.com is where you can find us and subscribe to further sessions. And we also have a session coming up in just 2 days. This is I'm so glad to be able to say this because it's the first time I've got like a session lined up right after this one that I can tease. We'll be talking with Dave Marsland, CTO of Fine Matter. You can find the event on LinkedIn by looking up SDX Next. It's going to be happening this Thursday, and the time in the Polish time zone, it's 3 p.m. GMT +1. So you can go ahead and convert that to your local time zone. Sorry, I don't have that right on hand right now. So I hope you join us for the next episode. And we're trying to up the ante with everyone that we do. Certainly, we did that today. So thank you, Charity, once again for sharing all that you know. And I guess that's it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here and sharing what you know. I'm gonna click the button now and broadcast. And thank you so much for joining us. Bye.
Yeah, absolutely. That was